The rescue helicopter circled twice before the crew could fully comprehend what they were seeing. Floating in the middle of the Pacific, 800 miles from the nearest coastline, was a sight that would haunt veteran Coast Guard officers for years to come. A sleek, expensive catamaran drifted aimlessly in the swells, its sails torn and flapping like wounded birds. But it wasn't the damaged vessel that made their blood run cold. It was what they found when they rappelled down to the deck. Two figures sat motionless in the cockpit, their skin burned to leather by 40 days of relentless sun, their lips cracked and bleeding, their eyes vacant as empty wells. Klaus and Ingrid Richter, a respected German couple who had vanished without a trace 6 weeks earlier, were alive. But what they had endured, and more importantly, what they claimed had happened to them, would challenge everything rescue workers thought they knew about survival at sea. This isn't just another story of maritime disaster. This is a psychological thriller that unfolds on the open ocean, where the line between reality and hallucination becomes as blurred as the horizon itself. What you're about to discover will reveal how the human mind can become its own worst enemy when pushed beyond its breaking point, and how two brilliant, educated people could make a series of decisions so catastrophically wrong that they nearly cost them their lives and their sanity. The official Coast Guard report filed that day would later be classified, not because of national security, but because the contents were deemed psychologically disturbing and potentially damaging to maritime confidence. But through exclusive access to rescue testimonies, psychiatric evaluations, and the couple's own haunting video logs recovered from their vessel, we can now piece together the true story of what happened during those 40 days of horror. This is a cautionary tale that every sailor, every dreamer who has ever looked at the horizon and imagined freedom needs to hear. Because what destroyed Klaus and Ingrid Richter wasn't a storm, wasn't equipment failure, wasn't pirates or whales, or any of the conventional dangers we fear at sea. It was something far more insidious, far more personal, and far more terrifying. The slow, methodical destruction of trust between two people who had loved each other for 37 years. Klaus Richter was not the kind of man you'd expect to find broken and babbling incoherently in a life raft. At 62, he was the epitome of German precision and preparation. A retired aerospace engineer who had spent his career designing navigation systems for commercial aircraft, Klaus approached every aspect of life with methodical thoroughness. His garage workshop in Hamburg was legendary among his neighbors. Every tool had its designated place. Every project was documented with obsessive detail. Every contingency was planned for and prepared against. Ingrid, his wife of 37 years, was equally impressive in her own right. A former psychiatrist who had spent 2 decades treating trauma victims, she possessed an almost supernatural ability to read people's emotional states and predict their behavioral patterns. At 58, she had recently retired from her practice, eager to finally pursue the dreams she had deferred for decades while building her career. The dream that had sustained them through years of long work hours and delayed gratification was elegantly simple: to sail around the world in their own boat, visiting remote islands and experiencing the kind of freedom that only comes from being completely self-sufficient on the open ocean. It wasn't a sudden impulse or midlife crisis. It was a carefully orchestrated plan that had been 25 years in the making. In 1998, Klaus had purchased a damaged 42-foot catamaran that had been written off by its insurance company after a hurricane. Most people would have seen only twisted aluminum and shredded fiberglass, but Klaus saw potential. For the next 6 years, he spent every weekend and vacation day rebuilding the vessel from the keel up. He didn't just restore it, he reimagined it as the ultimate blue water cruising machine. The boat, which they christened Zealand Frieden, Peace of Soul, was a marvel of engineering and preparation. Klaus had installed redundant systems for everything critical. 2 independent water makers, triple backup navigation systems, solar panels and wind generators backed up by a diesel generator, and enough spare parts to rebuild half the boat if necessary. The medical kit that Ingrid assembled could have stocked a small hospital, and she had taken advanced wilderness medicine courses to ensure she could handle any emergency. They had invested their entire retirement savings, nearly 800,000 euros, into the boat and their preparation. Klaus had even taken early retirement, sacrificing a significant portion of his pension to have more time for final preparations. Ingrid had turned down a lucrative consulting position to focus entirely on their upcoming adventure. But perhaps most importantly, they had invested years in learning to sail together. They weren't weekend warriors suddenly deciding to cross oceans. They had completed a 2-year sailing course with some of Germany's most respected offshore instructors. They had sailed across the North Sea in winter storms, navigated through the fog-shrouded English Channel, and completed a shakedown cruise to the Mediterranean that lasted 4 months. Every maritime expert who examined their preparation later would agree on one point. Klaus and Ingrid Richter were as ready for ocean sailing as any recreational sailors could possibly be. Their boat was bulletproof, their skills were solid, and their planning was exhaustive, which makes what happened next all the more inexplicable. The couple departed from Gibraltar on March 15, 2019, bound for the Caribbean via the Canary Islands. It was a route sailed safely by thousands of cruisers every year, a well-established path with reliable weather patterns and plenty of other vessels to offer assistance if needed. Their planned passage time to Barbados was 28 days, conservative by most standards, allowing for light winds and potential delays. For the first 3 weeks, everything went exactly according to plan. Their daily satellite communications with Klaus's brother Heinrich in Hamburg were filled with enthusiasm and wonder. They described perfect sailing conditions, spectacular sunsets, and the profound peace that comes from being completely alone with nature. Ingrid's messages were particularly poetic, describing the experience as finally feeling alive after decades of being merely functional. Klaus, meanwhile, was in his element. Every system on the boat was performing flawlessly. His navigation was precise to the nautical mile, and their daily progress was actually ahead of their conservative schedule. His communications home were filled with technical details about wind patterns, boat performance, and their position relative to other vessels they were tracking on their AIS system. On April 5th, they were approximately 900 miles west of the Canary Islands, still well within the shipping lanes and with clear weather ahead. Klaus's morning communication to Heinrich was routine and optimistic. Day 21, all systems green, 847 miles to go, ETA Barbados, April 12th. Ingrid spotted dolphins this morning. Life is good. That was their last scheduled communication. When Klaus failed to check in the following morning, Heinrich wasn't immediately concerned. Satellite communication equipment could be temperamental, and a day's delay wasn't unusual. But when 48 hours passed without word, he contacted the German Coast Guard, who in turn alerted their international counterparts. What followed was one of the most intensive search efforts in modern maritime history. Coast Guard aircraft from 3 different nations scoured nearly 100,000 square miles of ocean. Commercial vessels in the area were alerted to keep watch for the distinctive blue and white catamaran. Satellite imagery was analyzed for any sign of the missing boat. But the Atlantic Ocean is vast beyond human comprehension, and Seelenfrieden had seemingly vanished without a trace. For 6 weeks, the search continued with diminishing hope. Klaus and Ingrid's adult children flew to Barbados and hired private aircraft to extend the search area. The sailing community rallied, with dozens of private vessels joining the effort. But as days turned into weeks, the grim reality began to set in. Another sailing couple had been claimed by the sea. Then, on May 25th, everything changed. A Japanese cargo ship reported a small vessel on their radar, approximately 800 miles southwest of their last known position. The coordinates placed the boat in the middle of nowhere, far from any shipping lanes, far from any logical course to anywhere. When the US Coast Guard helicopter reached the scene 3 hours later, what they found defied explanation. The Seelenfrieden was still afloat, but barely recognizable. The once pristine catamaran looked like it had been through a war. The mainsail was in tatters, flapping uselessly from a bent boom. The jib had been cut away entirely, leaving only frayed lines trailing in the water. One of the solar panels was cracked, and the wind generator hung at an odd angle, its blades missing. Most disturbing of all, the boat's lifer raft was gone, its mounting bracket twisted and empty. But Klaus and Ingrid were still aboard. They sat in the cockpit like statues, staring at nothing, their skin burned almost black by weeks of unprotected exposure to the sun. They were severely dehydrated, malnourished, and according to the rescue medic who examined them, psychologically unreachable. Neither would speak, neither would make eye contact, and neither would allow themselves to be separated from the other. When the rescue helicopter lifted them to safety, Klaus clutched a waterproof bag containing what would later prove to be the key to understanding their ordeal. A handheld video camera with 41 hours of footage spread across 6 weeks at sea. The initial medical evaluation at the U.S. Naval Hospital in San Diego revealed the extent of their physical deterioration. Both were suffering from severe dehydration, despite the boat's water maker still functioning perfectly. They had lost a combined 60 pounds, despite the fact that their food stores were still 3/4 full. Klaus had infected cuts on his hands, consistent with repeatedly handling frayed ropes. Ingrid showed signs of chronic sleep deprivation that doctors described as extreme even for trauma patients. But it was their psychological state that truly concerned the medical team. Both Klaus and Ingrid exhibited symptoms of what psychiatrists would later diagnose as shared psychotic disorder, a rare condition where two people begin to share the same delusional beliefs. They refused to be interviewed separately, communicated with each other in whispered German that hospital translators couldn't fully decipher, and insisted that their real story could never be told because no one would believe them. For the first 72 hours after their rescue, they remained largely non-communicative. Klaus would only confirm his name and that of his wife. Ingrid wouldn't speak at all, instead writing cryptic notes in German that seemed to reference events that made no sense to their medical team. One note, translated later, read, "The water lies, the instruments lie, only Klaus tells truth now." It wasn't until Dr. Sarah Martinez, a psychiatrist specializing in maritime trauma, began reviewing the video footage from their camera that the true horror of their experience began to emerge. The early videos, recorded during the first 3 weeks of their voyage, showed exactly what you'd expect from experienced sailors on a dream cruise. Klaus appeared relaxed and confident, methodically checking his instruments and reporting their position. Ingrid looked peaceful and happy, often shown reading in the cockpit or preparing meals in their well-equipped galley. They spoke to the camera like proud grandparents, eager to share their adventure with family back home. Day 12, Klaus announced to the camera on March 26th. "We're making excellent time, averaging 6.2 knots. The weather has been perfect. 15-knot trade winds, following seas, couldn't ask for better conditions. Ingrid made her famous fish curry last night. I think I could get used to this life." Ingrid appeared over his shoulder, smiling broadly. "The sunsets out here are indescribable," she said. "Klaus tries to photograph them, but no camera could capture what we're seeing. We feel so blessed." But around day 22, April 6th, the day after their last communication home, something subtle began to change in their demeanor. Klaus's daily position reports became obsessively detailed, as if he was trying to convince himself as much as the camera. Day 22, position 15 degrees, 47 minutes north, 43 degrees, 12 minutes west. I've checked this position 4 times with different instruments. We are exactly where we should be. The camera captured Ingrid in the background, and for the first time, she looked concerned. Not frightened, but puzzled, as if something wasn't quite right, but she couldn't put her finger on what. Day 23, Klaus continued. "Small problem with the GPS today. It's showing our position as significantly south of where my celestial navigation puts us. I'm sure it's just a satellite glitch. These things happen. I've switched to the backup unit, and it agrees with my manual calculations. But Ingrid's voice from off-camera carried a note of uncertainty. Klaus, maybe we should try to contact another ship, just to verify our position. Klaus's response was sharp, almost defensive. I've been navigating for 40 years, Ingrid. I know where we are. That was the beginning of what maritime psychologists would later term isolation paranoia syndrome, a condition where experienced sailors begin to doubt their own instruments and eventually each other. By day 25, the deterioration was becoming obvious. Klaus appeared increasingly agitated, constantly rechecking his calculations and becoming frustrated when his various navigation systems didn't agree. The GPS is definitely malfunctioning, he announced to the camera. Both units are showing the same wrong position. It's probably solar interference or maybe military jamming, but I know where we are. Ingrid's voice from behind the camera was gentle but insistent. Klaus, darling, maybe the GPS is right and our compass is off. It could be a magnetic deviation we didn't account for. The look Klaus gave her was the first crack in their 37-year partnership. It wasn't anger exactly, but something colder, suspicion. Are you suggesting I don't know how to take a bearing, Ingrid? No, of course not. I'm saying we are where I say we are. The question is why you're suddenly questioning my navigation. The camera captured a long, uncomfortable silence. When Ingrid finally spoke, her voice was smaller. I wasn't questioning you, Klaus. I was just trying to help. By day 28, when they should have been approaching Barbados, their situation had deteriorated dramatically. Klaus appeared increasingly manic, constantly adjusting their course based on calculations that seemed to change by the hour. The video showed him working late into the night by flashlight, surrounded by charts covered in erased and redrawn course lines. Day 28, he announced to the camera, but his usual precision was gone. His eyes were bloodshot, his hands shaky. We've encountered some unusual currents, very unusual. The charts don't show anything like this, but the evidence is clear. We're being set further south than any current system should allow. Behind him, Ingrid could be seen at the navigation station, quietly operating their radio. Klaus whirled around when he heard the static. What are you doing? His voice carried a paranoid edge that was completely foreign to the man who had started this journey 5 weeks earlier. I'm trying to raise another vessel, Klaus, just to check our position. Turn it off. What? Turn off the radio, Ingrid. Now. The camera captured her confusion and growing fear. Klaus, why? If we're unsure of our position, we're not unsure. I know exactly where we are. But if you contact another ship, they'll try to help us. They'll tell us we're somewhere we're not, and then you'll believe them instead of me. The video showed Ingrid slowly reaching for the radio's power switch, but her hand was trembling. Klaus, you're scaring me. Good, he replied, and the word hung in the air like a threat. You should be scared, but not of me, of them. Who is them, Klaus? Anyone who wants to make us think we're lost when we're not. Anyone who wants us to doubt ourselves so we'll follow their instructions instead of our own knowledge. This was the moment. Maritime psychologist Dr. James Morrison would later write, when Klaus Richter's rational mind finally snapped under the pressure of isolation and responsibility. The meticulous engineer, who had prepared for every possible mechanical failure, had never considered that his own mind might be the system most likely to malfunction. But what happened next was even more tragic. Instead of recognizing her husband's deteriorating mental state and taking steps to protect them both, Ingrid began to doubt her own perceptions. This is the insidious nature of shared psychotic disorder, when someone you trust completely begins expressing delusional beliefs. Your mind sometimes finds it easier to adopt those beliefs than to confront the terrifying reality that your partner is losing their grip on sanity. By day 30, Ingrid was actively supporting Klaus's paranoid theories. The video from that day showed her nodding agreement as he explained why they couldn't trust any outside communication. They want us to think we're lost, she told the camera, her voice hollow and mechanical. But Klaus has proven that all our instruments are being manipulated. The GPS, the radio frequencies, even the stars look different. Klaus beamed at her with the satisfied expression of a man whose delusions had been validated by the person whose opinion mattered most. Exactly. Ingrid understands now. They can fool our electronics, but they can't fool 40 years of navigation experience. What made their situation even more tragic was that their boat systems were actually working perfectly. Later analysis would show that their GPS positions had been accurate throughout their ordeal. They had been exactly where their instruments said they were. It was Klaus's manual calculations that were increasingly wrong. Errors compounding upon errors as his mental state deteriorated. The couple had actually been quite close to several shipping lanes during the early stages of their crisis. If they had simply maintained their original course and trusted their instruments, they would have reached Barbados only 3 days behind schedule. Instead, Klaus's course corrections to compensate for imaginary currents and false positions had taken them far from any traveled routes into the empty expanse of ocean where they would eventually be found. By day 35, their physical condition was becoming as desperate as their mental state. The video showed Klaus looking gaunt and wild-eyed, his once precise engineering mind now focused obsessively on conspiracy theories that grew more elaborate by the day. "They're trying to starve us out," he explained to the camera. "Make us weak, so we'll accept their version of reality. But I've figured out their system. They can track us through our electronics, so we need to eliminate anything that sends a signal." The video then showed him systematically destroying their communication equipment. First, the satellite phone, smashed with a wrench until its circuits were scattered across the cockpit. Then, the emergency beacon, its plastic case cracked open and its antenna cut with wire cutters. Finally, their backup handheld GPS units thrown overboard one by one. Ingrid watched this destruction with the blank expression of someone who had surrendered her own judgment completely. When Klaus looked to her for approval, she nodded mechanically. "You're right, Klaus. We have to be completely self-reliant now." What they had done was eliminate every possibility of rescue or outside assistance. They were now truly alone, hundreds of miles from any shipping route, with no way to signal for help and no accurate way to determine their position. But Klaus seemed energized by this isolation. "Now they can't track us," he announced triumphantly. "We're invisible to their systems, free to find our own way." By day 38, Klaus had developed an elaborate theory that their entire situation was a test, either by government agencies wanting to evaluate their self-sufficiency or by supernatural forces challenging their worthiness to sail the world's oceans. He spent hours each day scanning the horizon with binoculars, convinced that their evaluators were watching from a distance. Ingrid had become completely passive, following Klaus's increasingly irrational orders without question. She had stopped maintaining their food and water supplies, stopped monitoring their position, stopped doing any of the basic tasks necessary for survival at sea. Instead, she sat for hours staring at the water, occasionally muttering to herself in German. The video from day 39 showed Klaus in a state of manic excitement. "I've figured it out," he announced to the camera. "The test. We're being evaluated for our ability to survive using only our own skills and knowledge, without any external assistance. That's why all our electronic systems have been compromised. They want to see if we can navigate by stars and compass alone, like the old sailors." He'd convinced himself that their ordeal was voluntary, that they were proving something important about human self-reliance. In his delusional state, their suffering became noble, their isolation a choice rather than a disaster. But the final video entry, recorded on day 40, revealed the terrifying extent of their psychological collapse. Klaus appeared calm for the first time in weeks, but it was the artificial calm of complete detachment from reality. "Day 40, he announced. "We have successfully passed the test. Our evaluators revealed themselves this morning. A beautiful yacht appeared on the horizon, watched us for exactly 1 hour, then disappeared. This was the signal that our evaluation is complete." The camera panned across the empty ocean. There was no yacht, No sign of any other vessel. Klaus was hallucinating with complete conviction. "Tonight we will be taken home," he continued. "Not to Germany. Home to the place where all true sailors go when they have proven themselves worthy of the sea's secrets." Ingrid understands now. She sees them too. The camera turned to Ingrid, and what it captured was truly heartbreaking. This brilliant woman, this former psychiatrist who had spent decades helping people distinguish between reality and delusion, sat staring at nothing with empty eyes, occasionally nodding at phantoms only she could see. "They're beautiful," she whispered. "So peaceful. Klaus was right all along." The video ended there. When the Coast Guard found them the next day, they were still sitting in that same position, waiting for rescue by beings that existed only in their shared delusion. The psychiatric evaluation that followed their rescue revealed the extent of the psychological damage. Both Klaus and Ingrid were suffering from severe dehydration-induced psychosis, complicated by extreme isolation and sleep deprivation. But even after their physical condition improved, their shared delusions persisted. For weeks after their rescue, they insisted that the Coast Guard helicopter had been sent by their evaluators as a reward for passing their test. They couldn't understand why they were in a hospital instead of the peaceful place they had been promised. Klaus became agitated when doctors tried to explain that his navigation had been wrong, insisting that the hospital staff were part of the same conspiracy that had compromised their boat's electronics. Ingrid's recovery was even more difficult. As a former psychiatrist, some part of her mind recognized the symptoms of psychosis, but she couldn't apply that clinical knowledge to her own condition. She wrote extensively in her journal about the conflict between her professional understanding of mental illness and her absolute certainty that everything Klaus had told her was true. The most tragic aspect of their story wasn't what they had endured, but what they had lost. The couple who had loved each other for 37 years, who had planned and prepared for their dream voyage with such dedication, had seen that love become a weapon that destroyed them both. Klaus's need to be right had overridden his care for their safety. Ingrid's desire to support her husband had prevented her from recognizing and addressing his mental breakdown. The investigation into their ordeal revealed several crucial factors that had contributed to their disaster. First, Klaus had been suffering from early-stage dementia, a condition that hadn't been apparent on land but became catastrophic under the stress of ocean sailing. The constant responsibility of navigation, combined with sleep deprivation and isolation, had accelerated his cognitive decline dramatically. Second, their meticulous preparation had worked against them in an unexpected way. They had become so self-sufficient that they never developed the habit of seeking outside assistance or verification. When Klaus began making navigation errors, there was no external reality check to correct his course. Third, the very strength of their relationship became a weakness. Their 37 years of marriage had created such a strong bond that Ingrid couldn't conceive of Klaus being fundamentally wrong about something as important as their safety. Her trust in him was absolute, even when that trust became dangerous. Finally, their isolation from other vessels, something they had sought as part of their dream of solitary sailing, meant that their psychological deterioration went unnoticed and unchecked. In a crowded anchorage or marina, other sailors would have recognized the signs of their distress and intervened. Alone on the ocean, they became trapped in an echo chamber of their own delusions. The recovery process was long and difficult. Klaus gradually accepted that his navigation had been compromised, though he never fully abandoned his belief that external forces had somehow interfered with their instruments. Ingrid's psychiatric background eventually helped her recognize what had happened to them both, but the knowledge came with a crushing sense of professional and personal failure. They never sailed again. The Seelenfrieden was sold while they were still in the hospital, its new owners unaware of the psychological horror that had played out in its cockpit. Klaus and Ingrid returned to Germany, where they lived quietly until Klaus's death from Alzheimer's disease in 2023. Ingrid still refuses to discuss their ordeal publicly, saying only that some experiences cannot be shared, only endured. The Coast Guard report on their rescue included a chilling footnote that has never been publicly released. This case represents a catastrophic failure of human judgment under stress, complicated by underlying medical conditions. The subject's experience should serve as a warning about the psychological dangers of extended isolation, even for experienced mariners. Most concerning is the evidence that their shared delusion system became so complete that they actively resisted rescue, believing their ordeal was voluntary and meaningful rather than recognizing their desperate need for assistance. What happened to Klaus and Ingrid Richter reveals a terrifying truth about human nature. Our greatest strength, our ability to trust and support each other, can become our greatest vulnerability when that trust becomes absolute and unquestioning. Their love for each other, the foundation of their 37-year marriage, became the mechanism by which they nearly destroyed themselves. Their story serves as a stark reminder that the ocean doesn't care about our preparations, our experience, or our good intentions. It will find our weaknesses and exploit them without mercy. For Klaus and Ingrid, that weakness wasn't in their boat or their sailing skills. It was in their own minds and in their inability to recognize when love itself had become dangerous. The psychological isolation of the open ocean can break anyone, even the most prepared and experienced sailors. When it does, the results can be more devastating than any storm, more dangerous than any equipment failure, and more difficult to recover from than any physical injury. Klaus and Ingrid Richter learned this lesson in the cruelest way possible, and their 40 days adrift stand as a testament to how quickly the human mind can become its own worst enemy when pushed beyond its limits. Every sailor who dreams of distant horizons should remember their story. The ocean will test more than your boat and your skills. It will test your sanity, your relationships, and your ability to distinguish between what is real and what your desperate mind wants to believe. In that test, even the strongest partnerships can become the very thing that ensures your destruction. The sea demands not just courage and competence, but the wisdom to know when your own judgment can no longer be trusted, and the humility to seek help before it's too late. For Klaus and Ingrid Richter, that wisdom came 40 days too late, delivered by a rescue helicopter to two people who had traveled so far into their own delusions that they could no longer find their way back to reality without help. Their survival was a miracle, but their experience remains a warning that echoes across every empty horizon where sailors chase their dreams, unaware of how quickly those dreams can become nightmares.